Good afternoon. My name is Ruth Shepherdson, and this is this week's lecture for AGRS 105, Section 2. We're going to quickly overview the livestock and poultry industries as we prepare to dive deeper into them individually next week. Let's start with the cattle industry. The cattle industry is the biggest livestock industry in Colorado, monetarily and in terms of frequency throughout the state, so it's a good place to start. When we look at the species of cattle, we really can divide domestic cattle into about three options. And the slide next has a map that makes so much sense to me. But you should know that we really look at Bos taurus versus Bos indicus. Bos indicus was a species that originated in Southeast Asia and is still very prominent there. You'll notice some phenotypical things like the hump on the shoulders, the big droopy ears, the brisket that's kind of baggy. All of those are actually to help it manage heat, because this species is a lot more heat resistant than others. Bos taurus is a little bit different, and it's the one that it's the type of cattle, if you will, that you'll see here in Colorado and all over North America. So it also is made specifically for the climate in which it lives. And if you take a look at this map, you can see that Bos taurus is primarily raised in that upper strip. It's a rather wide strip, includes North America, as well as our counterparts in the same geographic region on other continents. We see Bos indicus primarily raised in that strip nearest the equator. Temperatures are warmer all the time, and that plays a big part into what the animal needs to be able to withstand in terms of heat and pests and forage. And then we see that as we go more southern to the bottom of Australia and also South America, we see Bos taurus type breeds reemerge. Why do people raise cattle? That's the million-dollar question here. Unless cow prices are down, then it's not a million-dollar question. Whatever the case, in developed countries, the primary reason we raise cattle is a meat source. It is considered in developed countries kind of the ideal meat source, or has been at different times in history. But in developing countries, cattle are viewed very differently. They tend to keep their cattle a lot longer, whereas here in America, we may be harvesting a steer at about 18 months of age. They may keep the animal longer as draft power, because many of those countries are not mechanized and don't have access to tractors. In addition, they typically breed a little bit different so that there is a higher milk content or higher milk productivity, but we keep that dual purpose of also a meat source. As you look around the world, we see some kind of funny trends with cattle. The first thing we have to accept is that just because a country or a continent has more cattle in numbers, that does not mean they have more access to meat. For example, in Brazil and India, we see extremely high numbers of cattle. In India, most of the people don't even consume beef. In Brazil, many of those get exported. In the United States, we see very high meat production, mainly due to some efficiency work and some productivity in terms of bringing animals in, feeding them out, and reselling them. If you look at raw numbers, the United States contains about 7% of the world's cattle, and we, with that, produce about 20% of the world's beef. The idea behind American cattle production is typically that we are exporting our highest quality product and that we are importing a lower quality product. These two statements always catch people off guard, myself included. The idea here is that we produce a very high quality meat product in the United States. However, much of what people want to purchase is hamburger. And so many times those high quality beef are actually exported to other developed countries, and lower quality product is brought in, fed out, and harvested here in the United States as lower quality hamburger for things like fast food chains and, the average kitchen. This is the raw numbers of cattle production across the world. The darker the brown color are, the higher the number of head there are per square kilometer. And so you can see, if you kind of glance through that we have quite a few numbers of cattle in the United States, but in terms of lots of cattle in a condensed place, the highest amounts of cattle are in India. The specific thing you should know about that is that many of those cattle are not intended as a meat product due to the religious beliefs of many of the inhabitants of India. We also see large amounts of cattle on the kind of the eastern side of South America, if you will. Many of those cattle actually get imported to all other countries around the world. Some cattle production in Australia. It's interesting to kind of see how cattle are spread out, but the places also that they do not exist. That's also worth noting. Let's look more specifically at the beef industry in the United States. The average beef producer in the United States is 58 years old. Their average herd size is about 40 head of cattle. So if you consider that and realize that there are about 700,000 beef ranches or farms in the United States, 91% of those are family owned and operated. Now, this trend is constantly changing. It has a lot to do with how profitable the beef industry is. And so we see oftentimes smaller farms and ranches going out of business or being bought out by bigger farms or ranches. That mostly is driven by how slim the profit margin is. When the profit margin is slim, a producer has to own lots higher numbers of cattle in order to make this work. We'll talk about different sectors of the industry here in a minute, but there are about 30,000 feedlots here in the United States. However, about 93% of those have less than 1,000 head of cattle in them. There are some very large feedlots. They house hundreds and thousands of head of cattle, but there are also many small family-owned farms and feedlots. In the United States, there's about $90 billion brought into the U.S. economy or put towards the U.S. economy from the beef industry. That equates to about 92 million animals throughout the year. The beef industry is a large contributor to our state economy. These statistics are a bit old, so it'd be interesting to look them up again and see how they've changed. But at the time when we made this PowerPoint, it was a little over half of Colorado's ag income that came from the beef industry. In many rural communities, the beef industry is kind of the foundation of the ag industry there, provides jobs. Obviously, those farms and ranches pay their share of taxes, and kind of sometimes the infrastructure is actually based on that as well. I would say that Plateau Valley's main ag industry is also beef, and I would guess many of you have ties to the beef industry if you're not affected by it individually. Beef is definitely one of the more complex livestock industries, in part because one animal has to go through so many stages before it's harvested. So we talked last class about how like the poultry industry, for example, is a lot more reactive because within about 3 months, they're looking at a whole new set of animals. In the beef industry, we don't make that switch over, except for about every 18 months. And so the industry is a lot slower to respond to market changes. Some of the segments that we can divide the beef industry into include seed stock producers, cow-calf producers, yearling and stocker operations, and then as we get towards a finished product, the feedlots, packers, which also might be called processors, retailers, places like City Market, Walmart, your local butcher shop, and then finally you, the consumer. When we narrow that down just a little bit more, most of the beef production occurs in 3 stages. And so while we see the industry kind of sometimes combine different stages for some vertical integration, mostly we see production occur in cow-calf operations, yearling stocker operations, and then finally feedlots. There are different combinations of this in vertical integration, and that is sometimes linked to profit. So, for example, some smaller producers have found that they keep more of the profit on their farm or ranch if they go all the way from the cow-calf operation through the feedlot operation and sell a finished product. All other operations find that they need to sell those calves and just stay in the cow-calf sector. When we look specifically at the cow-calf sector, we're looking at about 32.5 million beef cows. This would mean that you keep the calf till about 10 months of age. So they're taking care of the calf till it's between 4 and 6, maybe 700 pounds. A large part of that industry also has to do with upkeep on the cow, keeping the cow healthy and producing as a female. This is the cow-calf inventory by state. You'll notice that in the middle of this this strip here, this is where the majority of beef cows live. In part, this is because of its proximity to wheat and corn production. Here's Colorado. You'll notice that we raise substantially less numbers of cow-calf production or beef cow inventory. However, it is still the main agricultural production piece in our state. A couple other states that we've circled seem to be kind of outliers in terms of what people expect. You'll notice that in the South, we have relatively lower numbers of cow-calf production. Until we get to Florida, there are some fairly large ranches in Florida. We see the same thing kind of all over the U.S. There might not be many cows, and then we'll find a pocket of cattle production. Next, let's look at the yearling stalker part of the industry. This is people who basically raise that calf on roughage. Lots of times it's just a grass type situation. Sometimes it's crop residues like corn stalks and beef tops. For about 100 days here, we usually keep those calves in the yearling stalker range. And so that takes them from anywhere between 400 to 600 pounds on up to 600 to 800 pounds. From there, typically that calf goes into a feedlot. 85–90% of the beef that goes through the supply chain actually goes through a feedlot at some point, and that brings them from that 700 pounds clear on up to almost 1,000 pounds usually. During this chunk of production, they are typically fed grain and concentrates. So these are going to be your feeds like corn and other what we might term hot foods, because we're really looking at putting finish on the animal. So we know that we want fat within the muscle as well as around the muscle, and that's what grades that steak up to a choice or prime range. And in order to do that, there typically needs to be a concentration of calories. More and more, we see parts of the industry that are actually interested in like a grass-fed or grass-finished beef. However, in the scheme of the entire beef industry, that's still probably less than 20%. Here are the main areas that we feed cattle in the United States. Do note that that's concentrated in the Great Plains, and that is in part due to its proximity to corn production. Okay. Let's switch gears to some of the other industries. We're not going to spend quite as long on these in the overview. However, you will note that there is an entire chapter devoted to each of them in the book, so we'll dive quite a bit deeper there. The dairy industry definitely has a global standing as well. However, we take a look at that efficiency and productivity again. For example, in Brazil and India, there are higher numbers of cattle, but in the US, we have lower numbers of cattle, higher efficiency to produce more milk. Both Israel and Saudi Arabia also have very high numbers of cattle and very good efficiency. The European Union and the United States kind of top the charts in terms of cheese production. The two of those together produce about 70% of the world's cheese, which is the main, I don't want to call it a byproduct, but the main maybe co-product with milk, because we use milk to make cheese. Dairy products are traded internationally. It's not abnormal to eat cheeses made in other countries. However, we very rarely trade fluid milk, in part because of the small amount of time we have in which it is considered good, if you will. In the United States, we have about 9.4 million dairy cows. The average age of a dairy farmer is similar to the average age of a cattle rancher. So it's definitely a generational thing, and we'll probably see some switching to younger generations as we go through. The price of milk has had some dramatic changes in the past 10 years, and we see that affecting how many dairy farms are family owned as opposed to corporate owned. I would guess that number is actually now below 97% based off the amount of smaller family dairy farms that have gone out of business. The average dairy herd size is actually now about at least 234 cows, if not just a little bit bigger. One of the biggest struggles on the dairy farm or in the dairy industry is actually workers. Milking has to be done at specific times. It is typically pay that is relatively low, and we have a lot of immigrant workers on dairy farms. Many times that's fine as long as the laws align, the paperwork align, and those people are here legally and able to stay here. However, the dairy industry does keep a close eye on those laws, because if we were to remove all immigrants out of that workforce, we would see pretty dramatic effects on the dairy industry. This graph shows how milk cow inventory has gone down over past years, but milk production has gone up. We actually have genetically changed the dairy cow so much that a dairy cow can barely eat as many calories as they need to produce the milk they do. And so that's one reason why feed quality is a big deal in the dairy industry. We need to feed those cows extremely high quality feed in order to keep body condition on them and keep them healthy, because they're putting out so many billions of pounds of milk per day. Some people are alarmed by the idea that we measure milk in pounds, but that is definitely how milk is traded, how milk is sold. It's, I believe, 7.58 pounds to a gallon of milk, so that can give you a little bit of a translation if you need. The main takeaway you need to know from this graph is that in the United States, the dairy industry has been on the forefront of efficiency and productivity for a good long time. These are the places where this map shows where the dairies are. And so you will see the states in gray are actually the states that have the biggest presence of a dairy industry. We see a lot of that happening in California. We see a lot of things in the northeastern part of the United States, and particularly up in Wisconsin in that area. It is worth noting that while we have a little bit of a dairy industry presence in every state, we're seeing that become more and more concentrated all the time. A lot of research has been done into the comfort of dairy cows. And I'm not sure that this will actually play, but I will try to send the URL to you so that you can look it up. The title of it always catches people's eyes: waterbeds for cows. Dairy cows are substantially large. They have a big frame size. We have bred them to have big udders. And because of that, comfort for them is kind of an interesting quandary. Many people have found that if you will provide a comfortable bedding situation for dairy cows, they stay substantially healthier. And it has to do with the pressure on their bones when they lay down. They spend a chunk of the time resting or laying down. And you can kind of see behind this man in the video that those boards sticking out, they call those stalls. And people are always kind of curious about, like, why do you make them stand in a stall? Believe it or not, the cows kind of really like the ritual or the habit of their daily routine. And so they voluntarily will go lay down kind of in the stall. I visited a rather large dairy outside Indianapolis a few years ago, and it was interesting to watch how much the cows wanted their routine and liked their routine. And when it was time to milk, this particular dairy would just open the gate. The cows were already lined up, and the farmers even mentioned that sometimes the cows went on to the milking machine. This one had like a merry-go-round milking machine. They actually went on there in the same order sometimes, or they would line up in stalls in the same way. So once these cows kind of become habituated, if you will, as to what they expect in their normal routine, they kind of like that routine, much like we humans like our routine. And that's why we go to the same classes every day at the same time. And you'll notice that here before long, the bell will ring. And just like a dairy cow gets in line to milk, you'll get up and move to your next class. Within the dairy industry, there's a lot of questions and research into how calves are handled. So we know that a dairy cow can't give milk until she has given birth. And so what we find is that those calves have to be taken off of the mother cow in order for us to use their entire milk production capacity for human consumption. Once a calf is born, the mother is allowed to lick them off. They are given colostrum, typically milked out from their mom within the first 5 hours of life. And you'll learn that that's really important to the calf's well-being. From that point, they are actually then put on milk replacer. And so the females are oftentimes kept as future dairy cows, and then the bull calves are sold. There's a little bit of controversy in the industry because about 10% of those bull calves are actually sold for veal, which is the meat of a calf, basically. The rest are sold and raised as beef calves. So there are people who their entire kind of beef production model is they go buy dairy calves, bull dairy calves, and they raise them up and sell them for hamburger. There is some kind of rumors and lies that those calves are just killed and disposed of, and that is untrue. They are typically raised as an agricultural product, much like the other animals in our society. The dairies that I've been to, I have joked that I think the dairy calves have it just as good as any of the other calves. They typically, while they're very young, have a little hut to live in. They're fed daily. They are well taken care of. They have vets on staff. But there is still some controversy over the fact that they are separated from their mothers, and that's how milk is produced biologically in the milk cow. Next, we'll go to the poultry industry. The poultry industry includes chickens, ducks, turkeys, and this lovely guinea hen. I think guinea hens are pretty. They're also super noisy, and they like to hang out in the middle of the road at my neighbor's house sometimes. The poultry industry tends to primarily focus on chickens when we talk about it, and that is because we consume a large amount of chicken as a society. We consume more poultry or chicken than any other food animal. In the United States, that means that we are primarily raising broilers and turkeys, but we also produce our own eggs. China definitely beats us in egg production. They actually raise more than 5 times the amount of eggs that the US does. In Chinese culture, eggs are eaten probably even more frequently than in US culture. Poultry has a benefit in that it is the fastest growing source of meat that we have. In a broiler chicken, we're typically looking at from hatch to harvest about 8 weeks at most. When you contrast that with the beef industry that we just talked about, that would be close to 18 months. That's a substantial difference in terms of market flexibility. The poultry industry brings in about $48 billion to the U.S. economy, and that includes about 8.5 billion broilers a year, as well as 100 billion eggs. We also eat a substantial amount of turkey here in the US. Coincidentally, much of that turkey is actually eaten on Thanksgiving week. The broiler industry has only been around for about the past 70, 80 years. It is highly mechanized. Before that time, I would say there was still a lot of broilers raised, but they were typically raised on people's individual farms and consumed by their family or their friends. Now we do a lot of that on a more commercial basis. So about 85% of the broiler industry is actually large commercial producers. And by large commercial producers, I mean close to 1 million birds on one farm. So we're talking about really, really big facilities. The broiler industry is centrally located in the southeastern part of the United States. This is primarily due to climate. Um, in order for broilers to continue growing, we have to keep the temperatures at a certain kind of rate. In parts of the US where it gets really cold, we find that those chickens don't grow as much during the winter because they're using all their calories to stay warm. We've also found that because traditionally we've raised a lot of broilers in these southeastern states, they're actually a little friendlier towards that industry and business, and that makes it easier for a company to be successful. They actually call this the broiler belt. It's not a belt at all. It's kind of a patch, but 2/3 of the broilers we eat in the United States are grown in this area of the United States. Egg production is a little bit more spread out. You can see in the brown patches on this map, it's kind of all over the place. Each brown dot indicates 60,000 layers. So it takes a pretty substantial amount of chickens to keep up with our egg use in the United States. I've always found it to be an interesting and fascinating fact that the average human eats about 250 to 270 eggs a year, and a laying hen typically produces 270 eggs a year. So if we all had one chicken, it might work out. This is where turkeys are raised primarily. The turkeys, I would say most of the turkeys are raised on rather large production farms, just like we talked about with broilers. You can see that there's really about 3 big concentrations of them, but that in any given state, we actually see a little bit of some pockets. For example, right up here in Colorado, in northeastern Colorado, there's a few really successful ones. The poultry industry is one industry that does a lot with vertical integration. And so this is a good time for you to kind of keep that term in your notes. Vertical integration means that a company expands its business operations into different steps on the same production path. And so that basically means the company owns the entire supply chain. In chickens, that's pretty common. A farm may hatch out the chicks, take care of the pullets. The pullets begin laying, they hatch. All of this could happen on the same farm, and oftentimes does. Now, depending on if that poultry farm was for laying or broilers, that might cut out some of the steps you see here. But it's very, very common for it all to happen on one farm, whereas in some other industries, it would be spread out more. There's a little picture of a feed mill at the bottom. That's because feed is a big deal in the poultry industry, so some of these companies actually mill and mix their own feed as well. Let's do a quick overview of the sheep and goat industry. The sheep and goat industry involves about 1.1 billion sheep worldwide. Across the world, sheep are actually better adapted than cattle, and so we see them spread out more. They are pretty efficient in terms of water. They're also very efficient in terms of nitrogen and the nitrogen cycle. Sheep were originally actually raised primarily for their fiber and then their milk with the meat as a byproduct. In the US right now, I would say the meat is actually more important than the others, but across the world, we see those priorities shift all the time. This map shows where the sheep and goats of the world exist. The darker the brown, the higher the density. Basically, here in the United States, we don't have very many sheep and goats compared to the rest of the world. You can see some of the hot spots, if you will. You'll notice that Australia obviously has a large population of sheep and goats. India has a large population of sheep and goats. They are the main meat sources because beef is typically not eaten. We see a lot of sheep and goats in China, as well as sporadically through Africa and South America. The average age of a sheep or goat producer is similar to the other industries we've studied in the 50s. We still see a large portion of those facilities family owned and operated, and most of them exist on less than 50 acres. I would say the disclaimer that tinkers with that statistic is that many larger U.S. sheep herds actually have leases on federal grazing land, and that has helped dramatically with their profitability and access to feed. And so I don't think that would be factored in. The U.S. actually has to rely on imports to supply for some lamb. The U.S. imports more lamb than it produces, and we see lamb prices typically pretty high as a result of that. In the U.S., there's about 5.5 million sheep and lambs. The top states for those sales are California, Colorado, and Texas. And then the top states for wool sales are Wyoming, Montana, and Utah. We see the sheep and goat industry primarily focused on the western half of the United States. The sheep and goat industry has seen some interesting things in terms of inventory and productivity as well. We don't see as dramatic of rises in productivity as we did in beef, but we do see some of that. As we turn to the goats just a little bit, there's about 2.5 million goats in the United States. Those inventories are typically focused in Texas, California, and Missouri. Each one of these dots equals 500 goats, so this map literally shows every goat in the United States. Well, kind of. And it's interesting to see where the density gets a little bit thicker. You can see that in terms of Colorado, we do not have a large density of goat population, although that I would say it is sporadic and spread out. I find it interesting that goat and sheep meat both have a lot to do with culture, and so we see higher goat prices always towards the southern half of the United States because the meat of goat is eaten more plentifully in the southern states and Mexico. Last but not least, we're going to look just a minute at the swine industry. There is a lot of pork produced in the world. The vast majority of that pork is produced in China. You can see that the European Union then takes about a quarter of it after that, and the United States takes about a quarter of what's remaining. So while we do eat and produce a lot of pork here, it's not as much as other places. As a sole country, we're the second largest global producer and the largest exporter of pork. We export a lot of pork, and it makes quite a large contribution to the U.S. economy. Most of the pork in the U.S. is raised in the Corn Belt to the tune of about 70%. Iowa alone, this is pretty crazy, Iowa alone produces 25% of all of the pork in the United States. Much like the poultry industry, pork is vertically integrated. There are many, many facilities that they call them farrow to finish facilities, all on the same farm for the entirety of the pig's life. Here is the swine industry in terms of numbers of farms. You can again see that concentration near the Corn Belt, and then it kind of spreads out from there. Again, Iowa having the largest production. When you compare Colorado's production to Iowa, we clearly don't have a large portion of the swine industry, a rather small one. You can see that in the swine industry, we oftentimes look at breeding hog inventory as a relation to the commercial hog industry. We have become more and more efficient in the pork industry, and that's a pretty big deal. As a result, we have less breeding hogs on hand, if you will, and they are more efficient to keep the same amount of meat. We also see that the pure number of hog operations has gone down over the last years, but we have seen the average size of each hog operation go up. Finally, I want to end covering a few of the livestock industries we would term exotic. These are maybe smaller industries, but also growing a bigger market share in the United States. The first would be the bison industry. We use the terms cow, bull, and calf, similar to the beef industry. Bison calves are not castrated, and they are consumed as a high quality, low cholesterol meat. There's about 2,500 private ranches and about 162,000 animals on those. I would say comparative to other industries, it's still pretty small. In the United States, we also have some elk farms or elk ranches. Again, we use the terms cow, bull, and calf. There's actually kind of a trifold of production, if you will. We sell the meat, also the antlers, and the velvet. We're looking at only about 40,000 animals in the U.S., and they are typically concentrated in Texas, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, although you all are pretty familiar with some elk ranches here in Colorado. This is the nutritional comparison of some of the other livestock species. You can see that in relation to cholesterol and protein, many of these exotic species actually have the same great protein with less cholesterol, and that actually has made them more marketable to people who are struggling with those health problems. And then finally, we have some issues, some industries around emus and ostriches. We will continue to study those as we get a little more in detail. Thank you for your patience. Hopefully this has been helpful, and have a great day.